put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The boy who made $65 million selling death. In 2015, a 32-year-old hedge fund manager walked into a small pharmaceutical company and made a single decision that would expose the darkest machinery of American capitalism. Within 24 hours, the price of a life-saving drug jumped from $13.50 to $750 per pill. Overnight, patients who needed this medication to survive were suddenly staring at bills that could bankrupt them. But this wasn't a glitch in the system. This was the system, and the man who pulled the trigger wasn't some faceless corporate executive hiding behind boardroom doors. He was a baby-faced millennial who live-streamed the whole thing, smirking into a webcam as the world burned around him. His name was Martin Shkreli, and what he revealed about the pharmaceutical industry, Wall Street, and the price of human life would make him the most hated man in America. But here's what they didn't tell you. The drug price scandal was just the surface. Beneath it lay a decade-long trail of deception, fraud, and a Ponzi-like scheme that turned desperate investors into unwitting participants in a financial mystery that reads like a business crime thriller. Martin Shkreli was born in 1983 in Brooklyn, New York, to Albanian and Croatian immigrant parents who worked as janitors. His childhood was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of working-class American story that should have led to a modest life. But Martin wasn't interested in modest. While other kids played basketball in Coney Island, he was teaching himself stock market analysis. At 16, he convinced a hedge fund manager to give him an internship. At 17, he was making recommendations that moved millions. By the time he graduated high school, Martin Shkreli had discovered something that would define his entire career. In the world of finance, perception could be weaponized. He enrolled at Baruch College, but dropped out. Formal education felt like a waste when real money was being made in the markets. By age 19, he was working at Kramer Berkowitz, a hedge fund run by Jim Cramer, the future host of Mad Money. The young analyst showed promise, but also something else: a willingness to bend rules until they nearly broke. In 2007, Shkreli was accused of insider trading, allegations that he vehemently denied and were never formally charged. But the pattern was forming. Martin Shkreli was learning that in the gray zones of Wall Street, fortunes could be built by those brave enough or reckless enough to exploit every loophole. At 23, he launched his first hedge fund, Elea Capital Management. The strategy was aggressive, focused on biotech stocks and pharmaceutical companies. Shkreli positioned himself as a scientific wunderkind who could predict which drugs would succeed or fail in FDA trials. Investors poured millions into his fund, seduced by his confidence and his track record of bold predictions. But behind the scenes, something darker was brewing. Elea Capital began to hemorrhage money. Bad bets, miscalculations, hubris. The reasons varied, but the result was the same: massive losses that threatened to expose the young fund manager as a fraud. So Martin Shkreli did what desperate men have done throughout financial history. He played a shell game. When Elea Capital collapsed, he immediately launched a second hedge fund, MSMB Capital Management. He used money from new investors to pay back old investors, a classic Ponzi-like structure that kept the illusion of success alive. And it worked. On paper, Martin Shkreli looked like a rising star. In reality, he was a 20-something managing a financial house of cards that could collapse at any moment. The question wasn't if it would fall. The question was how long he could keep the game going. By 2011, Shkreli's hedge fund empire was crumbling. MSMB Capital had lost nearly all its money. Around $7 million vanished into failed biotech bets. Investors were asking questions. Lawsuits were being filed. The walls were closing in. But Martin Shkreli wasn't ready to surrender. Instead, he executed one of the most audacious pivots in business scandal history. He decided to stop betting on pharmaceutical companies and start running them himself. In 2011, he founded Retrophin, a biopharmaceutical company focused on rare diseases. The business model seemed legitimate: acquire rights to drugs for orphan diseases, drugs that treated conditions affecting small patient populations. But Shkreli had a secret blueprint. He used Retrofin's assets not to build a pharmaceutical empire, but to pay back the investors he'd defrauded through his failed hedge funds. Company money was funneled into settlements, legal fees, and payoffs, all disguised as consulting agreements and other legitimate-sounding transactions. It was corporate money laundering, dressed in the language of pharmaceutical innovation. And then Retrofin made a move that would foreshadow the Shkreli scandal to come. The company acquired the rights to Thiola, a drug used to treat a rare kidney condition. Almost immediately, they raised the price from $1.50 per pill to $30 per pill, a 2,000% increase overnight. Patients and advocacy groups protested. But Shkreli had discovered something chilling. In the American pharmaceutical system, there were almost no mechanisms to stop drug price hikes. If you owned the rights to a drug, especially one with no generic alternative, you could charge whatever you wanted. The invisible hand of the free market had become a fist squeezing the throats of the sick and vulnerable. But Martin Shkreli's greatest weapon wasn't the drugs he controlled. It was his understanding of a legal loophole that turned American healthcare into a hostage situation. Here's the dark secret of the pharmaceutical industry that Shkreli exploited. Under U.S. law, there is no cap on drug prices. None. While other developed nations negotiate prices or impose regulatory limits, America operates on pure market dynamics. And Shkreli realized that for certain drugs that treated rare diseases with small patient populations, he could create a monopoly that was completely legal, buy the rights to an old drug with no competition, raise the price to astronomical levels, and wait for insurance companies and desperate patients to pay. It was extortion dressed as entrepreneurship. And the most terrifying part, it was all perfectly legal. By 2014, Retrofin's board had grown suspicious of Shkreli's financial maneuvers. An internal investigation revealed millions in questionable transactions. In September 2014, the board fired Martin Shkreli, accusing him of using company assets to settle personal debts. For most disgraced executives, this would be the end of the story. A quiet exit, maybe a settlement, a fade into obscurity. But Martin Shkreli wasn't most executives. He was just getting started. Within months of being ousted from Retrofin, Shkreli launched a new pharmaceutical company, Turing Pharmaceuticals. The playbook was the same, but this time he would execute it on a scale that would make international headlines. In August 2015, Turing Pharmaceuticals acquired the rights to Daraprim, a 62-year-old drug used to treat toxoplasmosis, a parasitic infection that can be fatal for people with compromised immune systems, including HIV patients and newborns. The drug had been around since 1953. It was off patent. It cost pennies to manufacture, but it was the only FDA-approved treatment for this particular infection. On August 10, 2015, Turing Pharmaceuticals purchased the rights to Daraprim for $55 million. The very next day, Martin Shkreli raised the price from $13.50 per pill to $750 per pill, a 5,000% increase overnight. A standard treatment course that once cost a few $100s now cost hundreds of thousands. Patients who relied on Daraprim to survive suddenly faced impossible choices: bankruptcy or death. Insurance companies scrambled to absorb the costs, which would inevitably be passed on to consumers through higher premiums. The entire American healthcare system shuddered under the weight of one man's greed. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Medical professionals condemned the move. Patient advocacy groups demanded government intervention. The media descended on Martin Shkreli like vultures. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Shkreli loved it. Instead of retreating, instead of issuing corporate apologies or hiding behind PR teams, he doubled down. He went on television and defended the price hike with a smirk. He live-streamed himself playing video games while the controversy raged. He trolled critics on Twitter with memes and insults. He bought the only copy of a Wu-Tang Clan album for $2 million and bragged about never listening to it. Martin Shkreli had become something unprecedented in corporate scandal history. A villain who refused to hide. He was playing a character, the arrogant Wall Street bro, the pharmaceutical bad boy, the millennial sociopath who didn't care about public opinion. But beneath the performance was a calculated strategy. Every outrageous statement, every provocative tweet, every media appearance kept the focus on his personality, rather than the systemic failure his actions had exposed. While America debated whether Martin Shkreli was evil or just trolling, they weren't asking the deeper question: how was any of this legal in the first place? Presidential candidates condemned him. Hillary Clinton called for drug pricing reform. Bernie Sanders refused his campaign contributions and donated the money to charity. Congress summoned him to testify before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. On February 4, 2016, Martin Shkreli sat before Congress in a tailored suit and invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination for every single question. He refused to answer anything. Then he walked out, went straight to Twitter, and called the congressmen imbeciles. America had never seen anything like it. A corporate villain who weaponized his own infamy, who turned public hatred into a brand, who seemed utterly immune to shame. But what the public didn't know was that while Martin Shkreli was playing the troll on the internet, federal prosecutors were quietly building a case that had nothing to do with drug prices. They were digging into his past. They were following the money trail back through Turing, through Retrofin, through MSMB Capital, all the way to the beginning. And what they found was a decade-long pattern of fraud that made the Daraprim scandal look like a sideshow. On December 17, 2015, just months after the Daraprim scandal made him the most hated man in America, Martin Shkreli was arrested by the FBI at his Manhattan apartment. But the charges had nothing to do with drug prices. The federal government couldn't touch him for that. What he did was legal, a grotesque but permissible exploitation of a broken system. Instead, prosecutors charged him with securities fraud and conspiracy related to his hedge funds and his tenure at Retrofin. The indictment told a story that was darker and more complex than the viral villain persona Shkreli had cultivated. It revealed a man who had spent years running what prosecutors described as a Ponzi-like scheme, using money from one venture to cover losses in another, lying to investors about performance, and manipulating stock prices to save himself from financial ruin. The core of the case was this. Between 2009 and 2014, Martin Shkreli had lied to investors in his hedge funds about performance, about assets under management, about everything. When MSMB Capital lost millions, he told investors they'd made money. When he couldn't return their capital, he created fake account statements. And when the truth threatened to emerge, he used Retrofin, a publicly traded pharmaceutical company, as his personal piggy bank to settle claims and buy silence. He issued stock and paid cash settlements to defrauded investors using corporate assets, disguising the payments as consulting agreements. It was fraud layered on top of fraud, a financial shell game that had somehow sustained itself for years. But here's the twist that makes this a true business thriller. Most of Shkreli's defrauded investors had actually made money in the end. Through his manipulations with Retrofin stock and various settlement payments, he'd managed to pay them back with returns. His defense team would later argue that, since investors profited, there were no actual victims. It was a bizarre legal argument that essentially said, yes, I committed fraud, but my fraud worked out, so what's the problem? The prosecution countered with a fundamental principle. Fraud is fraud, regardless of outcome. If you rob a bank but donate the money to charity, you still robbed a bank. The trial began in June 2017. Selecting a jury proved nearly impossible. Hundreds of potential jurors admitted they hated Martin Shkreli so much they couldn't be impartial. One prospective juror said he was the face of corporate greed in America. Another called him a snake and a dick. The Daraprim scandal, while not part of the criminal charges, had poisoned the jury pool so thoroughly that finding 12 impartial people seemed impossible. Eventually, a jury was seated, and for 6 weeks they heard a story of financial manipulation, lies, and betrayal that would have seemed implausible in fiction. Prosecutors presented emails where Shkreli admitted to raiding Retrofin's coffers. They showed how he'd manipulated stock prices by engaging in coordinated trading designed to inflate values. They demonstrated how he'd created fake account statements and misled investors about millions in losses. Former employees testified about the chaos inside his companies, the pressure to execute questionable transactions, the culture of deception that permeated everything Shkreli touched. The portrait that emerged was of a man who believed rules didn't apply to him, who thought his intelligence made him invincible, who confused cleverness with wisdom and arrogance with strength. Martin Shkreli didn't testify in his own defense. His lawyers wouldn't allow it. But outside the courtroom he continued his performance, live-streaming commentary on his own trial, mocking the proceedings, maintaining the troll persona that had made him infamous. It was as if he couldn't help himself, as if the attention, even negative attention, even attention that might send him to prison, was a drug he couldn't quit. On August 4th, 2017, after 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned a mixed verdict. Guilty on 3 counts of securities fraud, not guilty on 5 others. It was enough to destroy him. Between his conviction and sentencing, Martin Shkreli made one final catastrophic mistake. In September 2017, while out on bail, he posted an offer on Facebook, $5,000 to anyone who could grab a strand of Hillary Clinton's hair during her book tour. He claimed it was satire, a joke, harmless internet trolling. Federal prosecutors saw it differently, as a threat against a former Secretary of State and a violation of his bail conditions. The judge agreed. Martin Shkreli's bail was immediately revoked, and he was sent to jail to await sentencing. The troll had finally gone too far. On March 9, 2018, Judge Kyo Matsumoto sentenced Martin Shkreli to 7 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to forfeit $7.4 million in assets, including the infamous Wu-Tang Clan album, a Picasso painting, and an album by Lil Wayne. In court that day, Shkreli finally broke character. He cried. He apologized to investors he'd defrauded, saying he'd learned his lesson and grown from his mistakes. But the judge wasn't moved. She noted his lack of genuine remorse and his pattern of using public platforms to mock the legal system even as he faced justice. The boy who'd taught himself the stock market in Brooklyn, the wunderkind who'd launched hedge funds before he could legally drink, the pharmaceutical villain who'd exposed the darkest corners of American capitalism. He was going to prison. But even behind bars, the Shkreli story wasn't finished. In 2020, while serving his sentence at a low-security federal prison in Pennsylvania, he was sued by the Federal Trade Commission and multiple states for anti-competitive conduct related to Daraprim. The lawsuit alleged that after raising the price 5,000%, Shkreli and Turing Pharmaceuticals had implemented a strategy to prevent generic competition from entering the market, blocking competitors' access to the drug samples needed for FDA approval, creating distribution restrictions that made it nearly impossible for rival companies to develop alternatives. It was monopoly tactics straight from a robber baron playbook, updated for the pharmaceutical age. In January 2022, a federal judge ruled against Shkreli, banning him from the pharmaceutical industry for life and ordering him to pay $64.6 million in profits. The ruling stated that his conduct was egregious, deliberate, repetitive, long-running, and ultimately dangerous. He was released from prison in May 2022 after serving about 4.5 years. But the lifetime ban ensures he can never again profit from the industry he so ruthlessly exploited. Martin Shkreli had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of unchecked greed and the moral bankruptcy that can flourish when systems fail to protect the vulnerable. The Martin Shkreli story is often told as the tale of one bad actor, a sociopathic troll who gamed the system until justice caught up with him. But that narrative is dangerously incomplete, because here's the truth that should terrify anyone paying attention. Martin Shkreli didn't break the pharmaceutical system. He just showed us how it was designed to work. The drug pricing scandal that made him infamous, still perfectly legal. After Daraprim became a national outrage, other pharmaceutical companies quietly executed similar strategies. Massive price increases on old drugs with no generic competition. Insulin prices have tripled in the past decade. EpiPen prices soared from $100 to $600 for a 2-pack. The difference is that those companies hired PR firms and avoided live streaming their greed. They understood that corporate villainy is most profitable when it remains invisible. Martin Shkreli's great sin wasn't what he did. It was that he bragged about it. The securities fraud that sent him to prison. A relatively common Wall Street crime that usually results in fines and settlements, rarely prison time. Prosecutors went after Shkreli with unusual aggression, not because his fraud was uniquely terrible, but because he'd become a symbol, a face to attach to systemic rot. He was the perfect villain for a moment, when Americans were desperate to see someone punished for the wealth inequality, corporate greed, and moral failure that defined post-recession capitalism. But sending one troll to prison didn't fix the system that created him. From a business perspective, the Shkreli saga teaches brutal lessons about power, perception, and the price of unchecked ambition. He understood that in American capitalism, monopoly power over life-saving resources is legal and profitable. The only unforgivable crime is being obvious about it. He revealed that the pharmaceutical industry operates on a simple equation. Desperation plus monopoly equals infinite pricing power. He demonstrated that you can lie to investors, manipulate stock prices, and run Ponzi-like schemes for years if you're clever enough to keep the money moving. And he proved that in the age of social media, infamy is a currency that can be weaponized until it turns into a cage. The most unsettling part of Martin Shkreli's story isn't what he did. It's what he revealed about what's possible. A 32-year-old with no medical background could gain life-or-death power over thousands of patients simply by purchasing intellectual property rights. A failed hedge fund manager could use a pharmaceutical company as his personal ATM to cover fraud. A convicted felon could live stream his own legal downfall and turn it into entertainment. These aren't glitches. They're features of a system where profit is the only metric that matters, and moral guardrails have been systematically dismantled in the name of free market efficiency. Today, Martin Shkreli is out of prison, but banished from the industry he exploited. He occasionally surfaces on social media, still trolling, still playing the character, though diminished and irrelevant now. A cautionary tale that people reference, but don't really remember. The Wu-Tang album was sold by the government to an anonymous buyer. The millions he made are gone, seized or spent, fighting legal battles. The empire he built has crumbled entirely. But the systems he exploited, they're still running. Daraprim's price eventually came down, not because of regulation, but because a non-profit pharmaceutical company decided to create a competitor. That's how we solve monopoly abuse in America now. We hope that someone with a conscience will volunteer to fix market failures that the government refuses to address. It's a business model built on crossing fingers and praying for ethical billionaires. The real dark side of the Martin Shkreli business story isn't one man's greed. It's the machinery that enabled it, the legal frameworks that protected it, and the societal indifference that allowed it to flourish until a villain arrogant enough to brag made us all look at what we'd been ignoring. He was a symptom, not the disease. A troll who found the cheat codes to American capitalism and couldn't resist broadcasting them to the world. And when the world finally punished him, it wasn't for the greatest harm he caused. It was for the smaller crime of being too honest about how the game is played. In the end, Martin Shkreli got 7 years in prison. The system that let him do what he did got a minor PR problem and continued operating exactly as before. That's the dark truth they don't teach in business school. The real criminals are rarely the people who break the rules. They're the ones who write them. And somewhere, in a server farm or courtroom archive, the files on the next Martin Shkreli are already being written. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.